Professor Charlie Evans here. I thought this morning I'd record some of my remarks on medieval Russia. I recently had to put together a lecture for my History 101 class, and after I finished putting it together, I thought maybe I might as well just record it and then I could put it on the web and I can use it in future History 101 classes, maybe in my History 111 class, World Civ, and then also, of course, in my History 241 History of Russia class. And so I'd like to begin by really defining the chronological boundaries of what I'm going to consider as medieval Russia. And we could also, in a way, define the geographical boundaries. And so we can start with Kiev and the emergence of Russian civilization in Kiev in the 10th century as really the beginning point. And then the end point is pretty fixed. That's 1703 and the establishment of St. Petersburg as the new capital of the Russian Empire. And I'm actually going to shorten that a little bit, and I'm going to not really talk about Kiev and Kievan Rus, because I do that in a different lecture. And so I'm really going to narrow the boundaries down to the end of Kievan Russia, really the 11th century, and then we can go to 1703. And so that's about like approximately 600 years of medieval Russian history to be covered. And in the time span there, I just have a few key dates that we might consider. The 980s, of course, is the Saint Vladimir the Great, and the establishment of Christianity in Kievan Russia. And then really the high point of Kievan Russia in the 11th century with Yaroslav the Wise as Grand Prince of Kiev. And of course the end date 1703. I have three other dates there which are connected, some other dates which are really connected with the Mongols. And the Mongols play such an important role in medieval Russian history that we really have to consider them. And in my Russian history course, I have an entire unit on the Mongols and what they did to Russian society. 1223 was the Battle of the Kalka River. This was really the first appearance of Mongols in Russia. The Mongols had already been expanding out of East Asia, Mongolia. They were pretty successful in that expansion. And really 1223 is often considered by historians a scouting party, an advanced detachment of the Mongol armies raided into Russian territory. The Russians were a little bit unprepared for them. They actually had a little bit of problem coordinating a defense against the Mongols. And then at the battle of the Kalka River, of the Russian princes, the Russian prince armies were defeated. But luckily for them, the Mongols retreated. They did not follow up their victory. The Russians might have thought that they were going to be spared the Mongols, but that was not going to be the case. And in 1237, the Mongols returned, and they returned with absolute destructive force, destroying cities. The Russian Chronicles is a chronicle of woe as it considers the absolute leveling of Russian cities like Ryazan, Kolomna, Moscow, and then eventually even Kiev fell victim to the Mongols in December of 1240. And it's a tale of absolute destruction as populations were brutally slaughtered, cities razed as the Mongols swept through Russia and swept on their way into Europe. Their eventual advance into Europe was stopped, of course, by the death of the Great Khan, which required all the commanders to return back as the succession crisis was undertaken in the Mongol Empire. A 1240 Sarai on the lower Volga River was set up. This became the capital of what was known as the Golden Horde. The Mongol Empire was divided into hordes. These were the territorial entities that comprised the empire, and the Golden Horde was the entity that controlled Russia, most of Russia, from the 13th century into the 15th century. In general, the Mongols, it's been a quite complex historical understanding of the Mongol impact on Russia for centuries. That impact was really considered under the terms of the Mongol yoke, as the Russians of the time called it, that they were under control of the Mongols almost unitarily. But in reality, the Mongols were religiously tolerant. They really didn't care about the religious practices of the people they had conquered. What they most cared about were taxes and tribute. As long as the taxes and tribute went to the Mongols, it was generally fine and they are hands off. But if there were any evidences of resistance or any delays in the collection and forwarding of that tax and tribute, that became problematic and that would evoke the ire of the Mongols. The Mongol power in Russia really peaked in the 14th century, and then gradually after that, the Golden Horde began to break up into individual khanates, individual territorial states, so to speak, and eventually in 1480, Moscow was able to throw off the Mongol yoke, refused to pay the Yarlik, refused to pay the tribute to the Mongols, and that really is the end date that really symbolizes the final independence of Moscow, the final independence of Russia from control of the Mongols. When we speak of medieval Russia and we speak of the rise of Moscow to be the preeminent city, the preeminent controlling factor in Russia and responsible for the expansion of Russian power throughout what became Russia, we, we really know very little about the origins of the city. Our first real knowledge of the city, or the first real indication of the city's existence, comes from mention in the year 1147. It was a pretty small, insignificant little city, and if you look at the map here, you can see that it's to the northeast of Kiev. It's to the southeast of Novgorod, which were two of the other important Russian cities of the early medieval period. Moscow, since it was small, only gradually increased in size over the centuries. And as I note here in my notes, it was raided and sacked numerous times over the course of the centuries, most importantly by the Mongols, who did it several times. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the beginning of the 17th century, and then the French, of course, in the early 19th century. As Moscow's territorial control grew in size, this is something that historians typically call the gathering of the lands. As Moscow gathered lands under its control, this was a process that took centuries. The map here shows a little bit of that process of expansion, Muscovite expansion, by the different colors, the color scheme. It's actually a pretty nasty looking map, but it gives you some idea that territories were gradually added to the control of Moscow itself. I have another map here which shows the same sort of territorial expansion over time, and you can't really see the color scheme very well and how it works out in the map. But the most impressive aspect of this map is not only the expansion and control in what was known as European Russia, but also the expansion over the entire Asian continent, all the way to the North American continent and Alaska, and then actually down the Pacific coast into what became later California. It was really a massive expansion of territorial control by Russia, first centered in Moscow. There were actually two real contributing factors that allowed for Moscow to control and expand its territory. One is that it was really the tax collector. I'm kind of simplifying things and everything, but the prince and later the Grand Prince of Moscow was really the tax collector and responsible for forwarding the tribute to the Mongols. And that gave Moscow incredible amount of power vis-a-vis other territories within Russia, within the area, and then gradually allowed Moscow to expand its control. The other factor that allowed Moscow to be successful in expansion was the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church, when Kiev was sacked, the metropolitan, the head of the church in Kiev, moved to Moscow, and then much later that metropolitan was turned into a patriarch. And so the church became an important supporter of the Tsars. The church became an important supporter of the Russian state as it expanded, because that brought more people into the Orthodox Church and expanded the Orthodox Church power. And so, much like the role of the Catholic Church during the reign of Charlemagne and the support back and forth between a pope and emperor, the same kind of support for the church was at work here in Moscow during the Middle Ages. The two main enemies that Muscovite princes faced were the Teutonic Knights in the west. And the Teutonic Knights were Germanic knights who were Christian crusading knights who were attempting to spread Christianity, specifically Catholicism, eastward from their base in Germanic territories in the Middle Ages, and particularly they were trying to expand Christian control into the Baltic what would later become the Baltic provinces and Baltic territories. And so you had these crusading knights trying to move eastward, and then at the same time, the other opponent of Russian expansion would be the Mongols, who were located to the south and east of Moscow. Just mentioning a couple of the key figures in medieval Russian history. You have Alexander Nevsky. As we can see from this portrait, I guess we can call it a portrait, is Alexander Nevsky, and you can see the halo around him, which means he's considered a saint by the Russian Orthodox Church. Nevsky dates from the 13th century. If you haven't watched the Alexander Nevsky movie by Sergei Eisenstein with Prokofiev's film score, I highly recommend that you check it out at some point in time. It's a brilliant artistic collaboration between two brilliant artists, Eisenstein and Prokofiev, 1938. Nevsky was a prince of Novgorod, also at times Kiev and Vladimir. It's a really complicated history and everything. But he's responsible for the defeat of the Teutonic Knights, April 1242, the so-called Battle on Ice. The two competing forces fought on an ice-covered lake. It's April, it's pretty late. The thaw was just beginning, and the ice on the lake broke up, and that pretty much destroyed the Teutonic forces, the Teutonic army, and Nevsky was considered a hero for winning that battle against the Teutonic Knights. Another important early figure in medieval Russian history is Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow, and he was the first one to lead a victorious Russian army against the Mongols. This was in 1388, the Battle of Kulikovo. You can see here Dmitry Donskoy Yovanovich, great prince. This was the first indication that Mongol control of Russia was beginning to weaken. Even though it was the first, it didn't succeed in ending Mongol control at that time, but it was kind of like the indication that eventually the Mongols would begin to weaken and Moscow would be able to exert sole control over Russian territories. Um, the key person in finally ending uh, Mongol control was Ivan III, Ivan the Great, 1440 to 1505, end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century. He was the one who finally totally ended the tribute to the Mongols. He also married into the Byzantine imperial family, married the niece of the last emperor of Byzantium. Of course, Byzantium fell to the Turks in 1453, and so there was no longer a Byzantine empire. But the fact that Ivan married into that family gave him kind of a royal prestige throughout Europe because he had married into that family. He also is at this time that Moscow and specifically the Russian Orthodox Church adopts this idea of Moscow as the third Rome. Rome had been destroyed by barbarians in the 5th century, and that symbolized the Western Christian Church. Constantinople, Byzantium, had been destroyed by the Turks in 1453, and so the Russian Church adopted this idea that Moscow was now the true seat of Christianity in the world because the previous two seats, Rome and Constantinople, had been destroyed. And so we have this nice image of Ivan III, Ivan the Great, as ruler of Moscow and the princedom of Moscow. And then, of course, the most famous or infamous medieval Russian ruler was Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny, and his reign spanned much of the 16th century. When he was crowned Tsar, let's just say he had an extremely troubled childhood, to say the least, and that troubles helped to mold his personality. I'm not really going to go into those troubles, but you could read about them just about anywhere because they're so spectacular. Anyway, so when he assumed the throne at the age of 16, he announced himself as the first Tsar, the Tsar of all Russia, the Tsar of all Rus. And so that was a declaration on his part himself. It wasn't the church who declared him Tsar. It wasn't other kings and queens throughout Europe that declared himself Tsar. There was really kind of like no legality behind it or whatever. He just assumed the title of Tsar, which derives from the Latin Caesar, that he was the Tsar. He was no longer a grand prince. And from that point on, we have Tsardom of Russia, and then when we get to Peter the Great, we will get to the imperial phase of Russian history. Not only did he have a troubled childhood, he had a troubled reign. Although he greatly expanded the Russian border, especially to the south and east, especially in terms of Siberia, which began to be controlled by Russia at this time. His reign is problematic, and it in no way more problematic than this famous painting by Ilya Repin, Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan on Friday, 16 November 1581. Painted by Repin from 1883 to 1885 and presently is at the Tretyakov in Moscow. I'm not sure if it's on display. There have been several attempts by crazed Russians in the 20th century to destroy the painting. I think largely because of the depiction of Ivan here. And so what the painting is depicting is this famous event in Russian history unfortunate event in Ivan's own lifetime in which he smashed his son's head with the staff. You can see the staff is laying here on the floor. In a fit of anger, as his son had challenged what Ivan himself had been doing, Ivan smashed his head and killed his son. And unfortunately, this would lead to an unsettled period of time in Russian history known as the Time of Troubles, because the son Ivan was the real heir to the throne, and by killing Ivan, by killing his heir, by killing the competent heir, this would lead to a protracted period of civil war, social uprising, foreign intervention by the Poles and Lithuanians, famine that ultimately decimated the Russian kingdom. And it was only in 1613 that a little bit of stability emerged in Russia. Let's see what else I have here. And so I want to talk just a little bit about the Kremlin, because the Kremlin is truly the surviving feature of medieval Russia, the symbol of the kingdom. It largely dates to the 14th century, but greatly expanded. The Kremlin was greatly expanded under Ivan III, and this map just gives you kind of an overview of the enclosed structure, the walls, and the towers. And then in the center are the key cathedrals of the Kremlin. There were the palaces for the Tsar and his family. There was the armory, and we have some photos here that I'll show about the Kremlin. The first photo I have is I call it the clock tower, but it's also known as the Spasskaya Tower, and this is the main tower of the Kremlin, and this is the main entrance into the Kremlin and onto Red Square. Red Square largely lies to the east of the Kremlin proper, and then all the way around are the irregularly spaced towers. This is the most ornate and decorative of the towers in many ways. I think there's 20 towers now on the Kremlin wall, and most of these date originally to the reign of Ivan III, but they've been added to and expanded and modified in the centuries since then. So the Assumption Cathedral, or the Cathedral of the Dormition, like the other buildings of the Kremlin, dates to the 15th century, and this was one of the three most important cathedrals there, as this was the cathedral in which the Tsars were crowned as Tsar, and that lasted all the way up to Nicholas II. Of course, he was the last Tsar to be crowned, and so every Tsar, I don't know, I guess every Tsar after Ivan III was really crowned in this structure. And so I have that little note there. During Napoleon's occupation of Moscow, it was used as a horse stable by the French. And I think that says a lot about Napoleon. I think it says a lot about the French of the 19th century. The fact that they used the Coronation Cathedral as a horse stable. The Cathedral of the Archangel Michael is the second of the three major cathedrals there in the Kremlin, and this was the burial place of all Muscovite grand princes and tsars until we got to the transfer of the capital to St. Petersburg. And once the capital was moved to St. Petersburg, the tsars, the emperors, were buried in the Cathedral of St. Peter and Paul in St. Petersburg. I don't remember. I don't think I visited this particular cathedral when I was in Moscow a couple decades ago. I remember pretty clearly being in the cathedral in St. Petersburg, and let me see. I think I have pictures. If we went to this notes page of mine, um, notes on dead Tsars, I have images of the crypts or tombs of the Tsars in St. Petersburg. The other cathedral in the Kremlin is the Cathedral of the Annunciation. Um, this is characterized by the multi-dome domes on the church top, all the gilding. This was the personal chapel of the Tsars. The other important structure in the Kremlin was the Ivan the Great bell tower. I have a separate website covering this. Um, this actually survived the French invasion in the early 19th century. The French tried to blow the thing up. The French were um, there's no real good. I can't really use the adjective I was going to use here to describe the French activities in Moscow when they captured Moscow, when Napoleon captured Moscow and everything. But they tried to blow up the Ivan the Great bell tower. They were unsuccessful in doing that, even though they destroyed most of the surrounding building. But the bell tower itself survived, and it was always the largest structure in Moscow. It's much like in Washington, D.C., you couldn't build taller. Uh, in Moscow, you couldn't build taller than the bell tower. The armory dates to the beginning of the 16th century, and like its name, it was an armory. It was where they produced weapons. It was where they produced muskets, cannons, etc. Um, it's now a museum. It's now a museum of the Tsar's jewels, clothing, gowns, um, carriages, all kinds of every kind of accoutrement that you can think of that went with the lavish lifestyle of the Tsars of Russia was all now on display in the armory. So also, also within the Kremlin is the Tsar Bell, the Tsar Kolokol, which dates from the reign of Ivanova um, after Peter the Great. They're going to create the largest bell in the world, and supposedly it is the largest bell in the world. And you can see its massive size there. But unfortunately, it doesn't work. It was cracked. There's a big chunk out. You can't see it in this photo. There's a big chunk missing from it on the other side, um, and it's absolutely huge. I really, I have no idea where they were going to hang the thing, how they were going to hang the bell, how they were going to get it to actually bang or gong, whatever you want to say. But they never had to worry about that because it broke, and so there was no question about them ever being able to use it. And so, largest in the world bell is sitting in the Kremlin, and the largest in the world cannon or uh, bombardier, as as it's sometimes known. This was a bronze cannon from the later 16th century. And again, you can see with the people around it, the absolute size of the thing. It's huge, supposedly the largest in the world, much like the Tsar Kolokol. That becomes a kind of thematic strain in Russian history to have the largest in the world. Um, I read that There's evidence that it was fired at one time. I'm not sure when it might have been. It probably was not fired more than once because it looks like the thing could explode at any time, and how much gunpowder you'd have to charge it with. Um, but this is one of the monuments in the Kremlin. And like I said, Red Square is immediately outside of the Kremlin to the east. I have the picture of the Lobnoye Mesta. This is where many of the Tsar's announcements and laws were proclaimed from. And then, of course, the two most famous structures that most people in the world will recognize that exist on Red Square are, of course, St. Basil's Cathedral and the Lenin Mausoleum. The St. Basil's Cathedral, of course, is an absolutely magnificently beautiful structure with the multicolored domes. But what I found interesting when I visited the cathedral was that the interior space of the cathedral is almost unusable because of the multi domes. You had to support all those domes, and all the support for all those domes meant that there was very little open space within the cathedral itself, and so the cathedral really couldn't hold large gatherings of people. And besides the three cathedrals within the Kremlin itself were actually far more important, and those were used by the Tsar most of the time. And so even while the St. Basil's Cathedral is beautiful and a great example of Russian architecture, it really wasn't as useful from a religious point of view. The other structure on the Red Square, of course, is the Lenin Mausoleum, and you've seen that many times with Soviet or Russian leaders standing on top of the mausoleum watching the May Day parades or watching other parades across as they crossed Red Square. When Stalin died in 1953, he had himself interred within the Lenin Mausoleum with Lenin, and then the Lenin Mausoleum became the Lenin-Stalin Mausoleum. But he was subsequently disinterred or removed from the mausoleum by Khrushchev in the early 1960s as part of a de-Stalinization campaign. And so the mausoleum was left for Lenin himself. It's unclear to me how much of Lenin is actually in the mausoleum. There had been attempts over the course of the 20th century, attempts on the body of Lenin, and it was damaged at different times. And we also know for sure that the brain of Lenin was removed from Lenin because scientists wanted to conduct experiments to figure out why Lenin was so brilliant and what made him so brilliant and everything. But Lenin still lays there under glass, preserved for Russians, tourists, and interesting people alike to file by and have a look at him. Directly across Red Square from the Kremlin is GUM, Glavny Universalny Magazine. It dates to the end of the 19th century, and this is the Russian shopping mall of the late 19th century, which has continued to this present day. And it was always kind of fitting during the Soviet Union that on one side of Red Square you had of course the Lenin Mausoleum and the Kremlin, symbolic of the Soviet state, of the communist state, of communist Soviet power, and on the other side of the Red Square, you had this symbolic remnant feature of capitalism, a shopping mall with all the stalls inside and all the different merchants selling their goods. Of course, that was largely controlled by the Soviet state during the Soviet Union, but it's still in existence. It's still a shopping mall. In many ways, it's kind of reminiscent of like a farmer's market with people all having their individual stalls and what they're selling in GUM. It's a beautiful building. And at the end of the Red Square, you can see here's one of the towers and the wall going around, and you can see in the background. You can see in the background St. Basil's, and then here's the State Historical Museum, which also houses artifacts of Russian history. What's interesting is that this entrance onto Red Square um, was originally the location of the Izversky Gate or Voskresenia Gate, the Resurrection Gate. There was like a gate structure here. And in 1931, Stalin had that blown up or basically removed so that it made it much easier to have parades across Red Square so that the parade could come through this area and then cross Red Square. Um, the gate has since been reconstructed and put back in place, and I'm not really sure how they get onto Red Square for their major parades anymore. And at the far kind of corner of Red Square once stood the Hotel Rossiya, built in the early 1960s. Again, I mentioned the thematic of Russian history, the largest in the world. The Hotel Rossiya was reputedly the largest hotel in the world until it was finally demolished in 2006. Um, they couldn't really there was really no way to renovate it. They couldn't deter the cost would have been prohibitive. There were a bunch of different plans for the site and what to do with the site and everything, and so it finally just turned into a park. And so here's a picture view of the Moscow River. And I wanted to show this because in the Moscow River, of course, is it's the river along which Moscow originated. It's a tributary eventually into the Volga River, and so it's on a really major trade network. It was a trade network which was used by the Vikings in the 9th and 10th centuries, and so from the Caspian Sea up the Volga all the way up the river network into Moscow. And you can see here's the Kremlin. The Kremlin comes right down to the river, backs to the river, and the tall structure unfortunately has scaffolding around it. And this image that's the Ivan the Great Bell Tower, towering over everything in the Kremlin, and you can see it generally towers over any background that you could see in the city of Moscow itself. And it would be remiss if I didn't mention the Bolshoi, the main theater in Moscow, famed for particularly its ballet troupe. Um, Also, I don't think it's the largest in the world, but at one time it competed for being the largest theater in the world. And the Moscow Metro, you can see from the decorations here in one of the metro stations, unbelievably beautiful interiors in many of the stations. The metro was really the pride of the Soviet Union and the pride of Russia because of the ornate decorations in the stations. And my last mention, of course, is the Moscow McDonald's. In the 1980s, McDonald's approached the Soviet leadership about building a McDonald's in Moscow. It was a long process until eventually the McDonald's opened on Pushkinskaya Square, January 1990. It took years to build a thing. Of course, it was the largest in the world when it opened in 1990, and I'm not really sure where the largest in the world now is. Um, but it took years not only to build the structure, but to build the entire supply infrastructure for McDonald's. When McDonald's began researching agriculture in the late Soviet Union, it really discovered that it had no reliable sourcing for everything it needed for the McDonald's menu. And when you think about McDonald's, and you can think about it in derogatory terms or in laudatory terms, whichever you wish, but McDonald's had standards. It needed uh, lettuce, it needed tomatoes, it needed onions, it needed beef, it needed chicken, it needed fish, and all these had to meet kind of McDonald's standards. And it took that was one of the reasons why it took so long really to set up McDonald's, was because it had to kind of resource all these food ingredients, and it had to re-establish it had really established a farm network so that it had reliable supply of quality vegetables and products so that it could uh, put on its menu. I had been in Moscow um, in the summer of 1990, and little did I realize at the time that it was just 6 months after McDonald's had opened. But I was completely blown away, and I witnessed to the thousands of people who lined up to get into McDonald's, because it was not only was it a fad, not only was it something new from the West, but it also was a mass that's how what's the right word here? It was a level of quality on a mass scale that most Muscovites and Russians were not accustomed to in the in early 1990. And so those are kind of my remarks about medieval Russia. I wanted to give you an introduction to, generally speaking, some of the individuals who were important in the course of medieval Russian history. I wanted to give you some introduction into Moscow itself, because Moscow is really the symbol of medieval Russia, of Muscovite Russia. St. Petersburg was the symbol of the new empire of Russia, the new European Russia created by Peter the Great. I also wanted to give you some idea of the chronology of the boundaries of medieval Russian history, and just a little tiny bit of the importance of the Mongols to Russian history. Of course, Moscow is again the capital of Russia. The Bolsheviks moved the capital away from St. Petersburg and back to Moscow. And so it's kind of a return to an earlier age of Russian history, earlier, and it's the symbolic importance of Moscow for Russia. Okay, thanks for your attention.